Welcome to the lesson on entering your general ledger beginning balances as journal entries. I am currently in the General Ledger Center, and anytime we need to enter accounting information directly into the General Ledger program, we do it in the Journal Entries program. So I'm going to click this Entries button, and you can see when I rest my cursor it says GL Journal Entries, which takes me into the Journal Entries program. Now let's talk about when we might want to enter beginning balances in here, and then we'll talk about the mechanics of how to do it. Basically, what I recommend is to get a set of beginning balances from your current software program or from your CPA for the last closed period, and get as close as you can to the current period, because then you have less work in trying to recreate accounting information. So I always recommend that as you're implementing the program and you've got AP and payroll going and you're just about ready to get the AR going in Cobra, that's a good time to get your beginning balances in here. Because remember that the payroll, the AP, and the AR are generating their own accounting records, but you control when they hit the general ledger. So you can continue running parallel on two systems until you're ready to bring these balances over. So as I come into the GL Journal Entries screen, I'm going to talk about the screen a little bit and then how to enter your journal entries. The first thing we want to do when we create a new batch in GL, a batch of journal entries, because as you know everything comes into the GL in some form of a batch, is I click the New button, and what that does is brings me down into the Edit Entry fields with a default batch description, which I can override then with the name for the batch. Now, the big thing that a lot of people ask me is, do I enter end of year balances or beginning of year balances? Because there is a difference. And that really depends on what your CPA gives you. If you're entering end of year balances, then you want to be going into the prior year's last period or last month, and then go into the entry screen, because then Cobra will know what period you want to post those to. Or if you're doing it for the current year, obviously what you want to do is have that selected, and even the period that you're posting them to, whether it's January or your first period or month of the year, or if this is happening sometime during your year, you can select the exact period or month that these beginning balances represent. So let's go back into entries. I'm going to double click on New Batch, and I'm going to rename this batch now Beginning of Year Entries. Now you notice that I use BOY, not to signify boy, but rather beginning of year. EOY, end of year. EOM, end of month, that kind of thing. So I always use initials because I know what they mean, but you can spell those out if you want. Now when I press enter, I'm brought down to the account number field, and this is where I start entering the balances one line at a time. So if in your checking account you had a balance at the end of the year, which I bet you did, you can just press enter, and if that balance is a positive balance, you shouldn't have to change the entry type here. So let's say your balance as of the end of your last period was $10,000. I'll enter it that way, and as I hit enter, you can see it's brought up here into the batch entries as a debit. Now I can double click on this, which will bring it back down, and I could change that. Oh, I made a mistake. It was supposed to be $11,000. Okay, so a point about the entry type here, which is going to be very important for you to understand. The entry type represents what is the normal balance for an account. In other words, any asset account is always going to be normally a debit balance. So if you're entering a positive number to an asset account, you shouldn't have to change this entry type. But let's say your checking account was overdrawn at the end of the year, okay? So rather than it being a debit balance, what we need to do is switch over to the credit. Now I can do one of two things. I can pick up my mouse and click on credit, or notice the little underline under these two. I can use my Alt key and then select, for example, C to change it to a credit, which means I'm entering a credit or negative $11,000 in this case for this item. Now, I'm going to change this back to a debit. And I'm going to move on to other types of accounts. For example, if I wanted to get to my liability accounts, I can just start typing my accounts. If I know them, I can start typing them, or I can open my drop down and start picking my accounts from here. So let's say my accounts payable account, which is normally a credit balance, let's say I owed vendors $35,000. Now it's entered into the batch, and you can see at the bottom of the display there, it is keeping a list, a running total of my total debits and my total credits and the difference. So it's trying to help me as I enter my information. If I enter it incorrectly and I get to the end of my batch and I see I still have a difference, that means look at your entries, make any corrections by double clicking on that record and making your corrections below. But the idea is then to have, when you're all done with this, to have all of your entries in here that reflect your beginning balances coming off of your other system. So I expect to see many more entries than this. Obviously, this is just for training purposes, but you can see that this batch is in balance. I don't need to make any other entries. Now the key here is that it's not posted yet. It hasn't affected my general ledger yet because it's an unposted batch. So any batches that you enter in here will remain as unposted batches until you actually post them. Now keep in mind too, if you ever come in here down the road as you begin using the program and you see a bunch of unposted batches that have check entries as part of the description, you know that those came over from the checkbook reconciliation program or the checkbook manager. So as you entered manual items into the checkbook, Cobra's thinking, well, you might want to post those to the general ledger, but it gives you that control by keeping them in the unposted batches until you actually physically post them. So let's post this batch and take a look at what happened on the main GL screen. I'm going to post it. I'm going to verify that I want to post it. And it opens up the period that was on the main screen. So although you don't have to have that main period on, the period set on the main part of the screen, it does shortcut your time in working around the system, because you can always select any period on the fly anyway. But let's say I want these posted for January 1 because they're beginning of year balances. That's what I'm going to do. Now, if this batch were out of balance, it would have given me a notification. So if you didn't notice this difference here, it would have given me a notification. And although you can post batches that are not in balance, we seriously recommend that you not do that. We didn't used to allow you to do that, but some accountants said, well, every once in a while we want to do a one-sided entry or something. But as a rule, you don't want to post batches that are not in balance. So now batch number 1 is posted, so let's take a look at it on the main GL screen. So what happened here? We posted that batch, so it should be part of our batches. Oh, there it is. So as I can do here, I can move things around a little bit in this display. I like that. So I can see the name of the batch. I can double click on it, and even in the entry list to get to the detail that makes up that batch. And even in here, you can see the batch totals, but if you're working in any particular batch and you want to know what a set of numbers add up to, what you can do is highlight just certain records within the batch, and then when you click on the totals button at the bottom, you can get totals of those highlighted records. So if you're trying to problem solve, for example, you can do these kinds of neat things. Let's see what else happened. if we go into the period TB tab, I use this all the time so I don't have to print stuff out, and I can hone in on individual accounts and problem solve them all from this screen. So for example, if I wanted to see how things affected my checking account, I can double click on that account, and I can see now for January in the current period, that's what the P means, period to date, there's that $11,000. Now if I double click on January, I can see all the detail that makes up that $11,000. So as you begin using the program and you see your different sources, you'll see GL, which means that this came off of GL entries, AP, AR, payroll, and we have a new one called CB for checkbook. So you can always tell the source of any of your activity, which is really cool. And you should always see the net at the bottom here too. That should always equal what you see at the top in current period to date, because these are the two numbers that you're going to see on your financial statements, the current period to date and the current year to date. You can see also the open-ended architecture of our accounting. So anytime something happens in the current period, it updates subsequent periods, always keeping everything always up to date. You always have a current picture of how things look. But let's actually look at our balance sheet in this case. So I click on the BS button, which means balance sheet, and there again is my current period. I could select any period, but I'm just going to use January. And when I click preview, I can see now those accounts, because they only affected the balance sheet, that's all I entered, and how they look on the balance sheet itself. Okay, so that's the key there. Now the only difference between entering end of year balances and beginning of year balances is that if you entered them as end of year balances, obviously you went back a year, you entered them in that prior year, like the last day of that year, December 31st, for example. So we need to bring those balances forward into the current year. So what we want to do is make sure we're on the current year by selecting that from our year drop down, going up to utilities, and update prior year balances. Now what that will do, and you want to do this every year anyway as you close out last year or make changes to last year, you can run this utility at any time to bring the current year's balances all up to date. Doesn't hurt anything. If you think you made changes and you weren't sure you ran this, go ahead and run it again anyway. So what this does is it kind of does some thinking for you. Well, you want to update your prior year from 2004 because Cobra is saying, okay, you have the current setting at 2005, so you want to grab your end of year balances for 2004, bring them up to 2005 as beginning balances for 2005 then. And you always want to make sure that your retained earnings account is displayed in here. So when I say update, if there are any balances then that were done as end of year balances, then how you would see them in your period trial balance is as beginning balances over here. And this is only on balance sheet accounts. So you'd see them as beginning balances, and actually you would see them as prior period to date, prior year to date, flowing through as if you never skipped a beat from last year coming into this year. So that's the difference between end of year balances and beginning of year balances, because there's been some adjustment of your retained earnings between the end of year and the beginning of year. So depends on how your accountant gets them to you. Are they end of year balances from last year, or are they beginning of year balances for this year? It's important to know that. This ends the lesson on entering journal entries.